I believe we're live. Hey everyone, good morning. We're here with Eric Sammons, the dad of Catholic Twitter. How did you get that title, Dad of Catholic Twitter?
Somebody just gave it to me, and I think it had something to do with the fact that I don't get in squabbles too much, and I guess I'm a voice of reason, which kind of tells you something more about Twitter than it does about me, I think. And honestly, I'm old. That's the other reason. I'm like probably 10 to 20 years older than at least than everybody else on there. So that makes me the default dad. I'm just glad they didn't call me the granddad of Catholic Twitter.
That's great. I want to jump right into this because I have several questions I want to ask you. I know our audience is going to have questions too. So do you mind if we just hit the ground running?
Yep, let's go.
How did you discover the traditional Latin Mass?
Well, it's interesting because I actually came through it somewhat a roundabout way through the East. You see the icons behind me. I really love the East, and I was very much interested in the Eastern divine liturgies. And so I would somewhat regularly go. This is when I lived in the Washington, D.C. area, lots of different parishes, lots of different Eastern Catholic parishes as well there. And I would go semi-regularly to an Eastern Catholic divine liturgy. This is the late 90s, early 2000s. And I really just fell in love with the reverence, with the beauty of those liturgies. And I think subconsciously a little bit, and even eventually consciously, I started thinking, why don't we have this in the West? And I honestly didn't know the answer at the time that much. And then as I started to learn more, I started to find out about the traditional Latin Mass. And so I finally went to one, I want to say maybe 15 years ago, something like that, in Washington, D.C. And it's kind of a funny story because I just went by myself. My wife and kids were out of town. So I drove downtown, went to a traditional Latin Mass. And I think it was a low Mass. And so it was pretty crowded. And I just sit there and I kneel and praying. And at some point, the priest comes out and doing things. People are kneeling. I don't realize the Mass has started until 10 minutes or so into it. All of a sudden, when I realize, oh, they actually started up there, because, of course, for those of you who have gone to traditional Latin Mass regularly, in a low Mass, the prayers at the foot of the altar. There's not really a lot of ceremony. The priest just came in from the side, and I was kind of far back because the big church, so I didn't really see everything. But it was just a funny thing. And I'll be honest, I walked out of that first one thinking, whatever. I wasn't really that impressed by anything like that. But then a couple years after that, the Archdiocese of Washington, they had a solemn high Mass, traditional Latin Mass, for the Feast of the Presentation. And it was just the most awe-inspiring, beautiful thing I've ever seen. They had a ton of all these seminarians were serving. They had all these priests. I mean, they had the whole works. And it was just so amazing. And one thing I remember from going to that was thinking, oh, wow, there's a lot I see here that's very similar to the Eastern divine liturgies that I love. A lot of the reverence, a lot of the little things, like even things like when the server hands something to the priest hands something to the server, they kiss the hand and things like that, which is also common in the Eastern liturgies. And so, and I kind of now joke that whereas I still love the Eastern Catholic liturgies, I feel like when I go there, that's like a vacation, but really home is the traditional Latin Mass, because I'm Western. I mean, that's just who I am. And so it's kind of like when you go on vacation, you're there and you think, I wouldn't mind living here, but really, you don't really want to live there. It's more like you just enjoy being there. And that's the same thing for me with the Eastern liturgies, whereas the traditional Latin Mass has become more my home, where this is where I feel like who I am worships God in the best possible way.
Yeah, the other guy we interviewed for the documentary so far, it was you and Dr. Michael Carter. And Dr. Carter said the Eastern liturgy is kind of like having Thanksgiving dinner at your, cousin's house.
Right. Right, exactly. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. But you're not eating there every night if you're Western.
Right. West side, strong side.
That's right.
So you currently raise your family with the traditional Latin Mass. So why is that? Why did you stay with it?
So what happened is actually we ended up moving away from the Washington, D.C. area. And where we moved, and so at the time we were still going to a regular ordinary form parish. But I had this love of the traditional Latin Mass kind of in the background. So we moved, and where we moved to be honest, the parishes nearby left a lot to be desired, and particularly in the reverence of the liturgies. But there was a FSSP parish, which is all traditional Latin rite of all the sacraments. And so we thought, well, let's go here and see. We already know we kind of like that, but we weren't thinking that we would go to a fully Latin Mass type parish. So in a sense, we just started going there because it was the best option that we had available. But over time, as we went there over the years, kept going there, we started to really realize this is a great way to form our children, because a point we've always had, my wife and I, since we were married 25 years ago with our kids, is that we understood the importance that when we went to Mass, our children are taught a lot of things subconsciously, just being there. And so how things are done, the building, how the homilies are, how they have servers, the music, everything about it is part of the catechesis that my children receive, and a very important part. In fact, you could teach everything at home as well as possible, but if every Sunday they're going to a parish where Mass is the source and summit of our Catholic faith, if it's done in a way that really mitigates against the reverence we give to God, the beauty of the liturgy, the necessary for proper worship to God, you're really undercutting yourself. And so as we went to this Latin Mass parish, we realized more and more that this helps foster what we were teaching at home, that it really does show in a very real sense that these people here really believe what they're saying. And I'm not trying to criticize everywhere else. I'm just saying, though, I have been at parishes before where I could understand somebody walking in and thinking, do they really believe this stuff? Because it doesn't really appear like they do by the way they're worshiping God. Yeah. And that might be through ignorance, might be through different reasons. But the point is, my kids, their faith formation is the most important thing to me. And so I want to make sure when they walk into a parish, they know, okay, these people really believe the Catholic faith, and they're doing their best to worship God in the most reverent, beautiful way possible. So that, in the end, was why we decided to keep going to Latin Mass, because I've moved a few times in my life, you'll be able to tell. We then moved after about 5 or 6 years at that location to another city. And at that point we knew, okay, let's find the parish that offered the Latin Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, that was reverent and did things in the way that would foster our children's faith life.
Yeah, so it sounds like it took a little bit of time for you to get acclimated to the Latin Mass. Like you're waiting initially for the priest to greet you, at the beginning, and then to walk you through the liturgy. And that was my experience too. I kept getting lost because I would be reading and looking up and waiting for the priest to say something, but at a low Mass, it's so quiet. So. Right. And I remember you saying also it takes time for people. Like that's some people's first experience of the Latin Mass, is they go and it's like, especially if it's a low Mass, it feels like it was nothing special for some people.
Right.
But it takes time, right? It takes time to get accustomed
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the biggest barriers for a lot of Catholics to the traditional Latin Mass, is we have to remember the Mass is intended to be the regular worship of the church, which means a Catholic will be experiencing the Mass, at least once a week their entire lives over a maybe 70, 80-year period. It is not intended to be a immediate evangelization catechesis tool where we're trying to hit them, almost like how you have we have a lot of conferences now in the church, and those can be very good. What the purpose of a conference is to hit people, so that they go there, they have an experience, and they go home, and that experience was very obvious to them, and it was very concrete and direct. So they know exactly what they were trying to be told. The Mass isn't intended to be like that. You go to it once and you may take nothing out of it, really, at least consciously not take anything out of it. I think you do subconsciously take something out of it. But that's okay, because in the normal scheme of things, somebody's going to go to Mass hundreds and hundreds of times over the course of their life. And so over time, that starts to seep in, and all the lessons that the Mass is teaching you start to really seep in. And that, for example, the yearly calendar, how there's every year you have the same readings. And so all those things, like, okay, on the Feast of the Transfiguration, for example, you always have the same readings. And over maybe 10, 15 years, that starts to seep in. And that's the way it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be an immediate and direct thing. It's supposed to be a long-term thing. I would say, for example, in my life, I spent about 5 years going to the Latin Mass maybe a couple times a year and appreciating it, but not really understanding it completely. And then when I started going regularly, where I went every Sunday, I would say it took me about, I don't really think I get it all right now after 10 years later, but I would say within about a year or so is when I started to feel comfortable, in the sense of I wasn't constantly thinking, okay, what's going on here? What are they trying to say here? Things like that. It more had just kind of become part of how I worship. So it's definitely something that takes time. And I feel like whenever I hear somebody's going to Latin Mass for the first time, I always try to just tell them, listen, just sit there, and kneel and stand and whatever, and experience it. Don't try to understand it. Don't even try to follow along. Just go there and just let it kind of subconsciously seep in, and just walk away from that. Don't expect some experience, because sometimes we have that. Like I was talking about conferences. I grew up Protestant. I remember in high school, I went to a conference where they asked us to come forward and receive Jesus as our personal Lord and Savior. And I did that. And it was a big deal. I can remember that to this day as a major moment in my life. It was this emotional experience. Nothing like that's going to happen the first time you go to a Latin Mass, more than likely. Maybe if it's a solemn high Mass, it could. And I'm not saying God can't work through even a low Mass like that. But typically that's not the intention. The intention is just to, over time, how you see God and how you worship him is going to be impacted.
So what would you say to people who would say they're comfortable with Novus Ordo? Like, maybe they tried Latin Mass, it wasn't for them. They see kind of Novus Ordo and traditional Latin Mass as kind of like preferences. Like, you have, Novus Ordo is like simpler, it's to the point. I hear the homily and then receive Jesus, and I like that I'm in and out, and it's very straightforward. The Latin Mass has more aesthetics to it. It might be beautiful, but it's really complex and can be confusing. So what do you say to people who just see them as like preferences, like you can be either,
Right.
Yeah.
I think a couple things I would say. The first one is that we should remember the history of each, in the sense that the traditional Latin Mass was developed organically over a very long period of time. It's called the Rite of St. Gregory the Great. From Gregory, who was 1,500 years ago. And it has developed over time. Some people sometimes try to act like traditional Catholics claim the traditional Latin Mass was fixed in stone by Jesus and never changed. No, we know it's changed over time, organically. But it was the Mass that was celebrated by the Church, the Western part of the Church, universally over hundreds of years of time. And it's developed these saints and all this great works of art, and it's inspired great music, all these things it's done. And so we shouldn't, and to compare it to a form of the Mass that's only been around for 50 years, I think it should be obvious which one at least should be given pride of preference. If I'll talk about the preference question in a second, because of the fact it has this long and esteemed history. And so I would say, don't judge the Latin Mass on one encounter, or even a couple. I always tell people, if you have a Latin Mass available to you, go to it for maybe 2 months, every Sunday for 2 months. And I'm willing to bet the vast majority of people who do that, Catholics who do that, will come to see that this is really the fulfillment of worship, Catholic worship, as it's intended to be. I really do believe that they'll think that. And I do think that the idea of preference, our preferences are somewhat irrelevant because, in a sense, our preferences for most Catholics, the preference is for the Novus Ordo, the ordinary form, simply because that's what they've experienced for 50 years.
Yeah.
Even the people who are older, who may be in their 70s, they've still experienced the Novus Ordo most of their life and almost all of their adult life. And for those of us who weren't even born yet, me barely, but still, when the Novus Ordo came out, then that's all we've experienced. And so, of course, it's because it's familiar, we always prefer the familiar. But we shouldn't be looking at preference in the sense of, okay, what am I most comfortable with? We should be looking at how has the church taught about the liturgy? What have the saints said about the liturgy? What is the purpose of the liturgy? And when we see all of those, and when we consider all those factors, I really think we see that the traditional Latin Mass kind of checks all the boxes, so to speak, all the boxes of reverence, of the proper worship of God, of the role of the priest, the role of the laity. All these things all happen in a very full way in the traditional Latin Mass. And so I really believe every Catholic should at least give it the best chance they can. And I know availability is an issue in a lot of places, but if it is available, at least give it a couple months of regularly going there, and you'll see it starts to change how you even think about the liturgy and how you think about worship.
Do you think you're better than other Catholics because you attend TLM?
Well, I went to confession yesterday, and if my confessor was allowed to say out loud what I confess, he would answer that absolutely not. But that's a good, I know it's somewhat of a joke question, but it's really not, because we get this a lot, where if I will say that I believe the traditional Latin Mass is a superior form of worship to the Novus Ordo. I really do believe that. However, I had nothing to do with either one. So how could I be better stating that fact? It doesn't say anything about me. I didn't develop the traditional Latin Mass. I didn't develop the Novus Ordo. So it's not about me. And in fact, it's a matter of how holy somebody is. There are objective and subjective factors in that. And so the holiness of a person is based upon the objective fact of the graces they receive. So therefore, somebody who goes to confession regularly, receives communion regularly, things like that, prays regularly, reads the Bible regularly, all those things, objectively, they are opening themselves up to graces, more graces, in order to be more holy. So that's an objective fact that cannot be denied. Subjectively, though, you have to still be of the state of mind and of will and in which your soul receives those graces. And so therefore, somebody could be go to the Novus Ordo every week and be very open to the graces that are given there, and could live out their life in a very saintly manner, whereas somebody could go to the traditional Latin Mass regularly and be closed off to them. Maybe they're very bitter about things or whatever the case may be, and they would not be as holy as the person went to Novus Ordo. So it's all a matter of the objective and subjective there. In fact, I've wrote one time that, I won't say who they are, but there's a family I know, it's probably the holiest family I know, and they've always gone Novus Ordo. They still go to Novus Ordo, and I still would claim they're the holiest family I personally know. But I do believe that when I say that the traditional Latin Mass is a superior form of the liturgy to Novus Ordo, what I'm stating is simply the fact that it allows us, because of many of the externals and how is worship, it allows us to be more open to those graces, because it understands the human person better, in order that we might see that, okay, we can be open to those graces. For example, if you are sitting in the middle of a football game, NFL football game, actually, let's go NBA game, because it gets crazy. If you've ever been to an NBA game, you have all the lights, stuff like that. You could sit there and you can pray, and no doubt you can pray, and you should pray. You should pray always. Or you could be in a monastery out in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of monks sitting in a church with a tabernacle with the Blessed Sacrament exposed, praying. Now, anybody who says you can't pray at the NBA game is wrong. However, I think all of us would understand that you are going to be more open to hearing what God has to tell you, more than likely at that monastery, not at the NBA game, because we're body and soul composites. We're not just souls, spirits that are disembodied. Our bodies are part of our worship, and so therefore, the things we see, the things we hear, the things we smell, touch, all those things help us in our prayer life. It helps us in our worship of God. And so what we want to do with the Mass, which is the highest form of worship we have, we want to make it so that the experience is such that we're most open to those graces that we can receive. And the traditional Latin Mass, as I've already mentioned, over 1,000 years has been developed with understanding that in mind. And so every change in the development of the traditional Latin Mass has been done through hundreds of years of experience of realizing what is best for the human person in worshiping God. And that's why I would claim it's a superior form, but that doesn't, and hopefully what that means is that those who go there are receiving the graces more fully. But again, there's that subjective element. So definitely I don't claim to be better. In fact, I kind of claim that I go to traditional Latin Mass because I know I'm not better. I need those graces. I need those helps, those external helps, in order to pray better and to worship God better.
It reminds me of a quote, I think from St. Peter Julian Amard, the apostle of the Eucharist. He said, "You receive the Eucharist, or the imperfect receive the Eucharist in order to become perfect, and the perfect receive the Eucharist in order to remain so."
Right. I'm in the imperfect category.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You're one of them. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So you were a director of evangelization with the diocese, which I think is really interesting. You have a lot of experience with evangelization in particular. I served with a national evangelization teams, Net Ministries.
Net. I know a lot of people who have done that.
Yeah, for 3 years. So I think you and I both have different but varied and extensive experience with evangelization. I would love to hear your perspective on how the traditional Latin Mass helps with evangelization.
It's interesting because my views on this have evolved over the years, because I've been doing Catholic evangelization for literally over 25 years, and I've really changed my view of how the Mass relates to evangelization. And the most important point, I think, when it comes to the Mass evangelization is the purpose of the Mass is not evangelization.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is we don't celebrate Mass in order to bring people into the faith. We don't celebrate Mass in order to attract people to Catholicism. We celebrate the Mass to worship God, period, end of story. Now, that being said, a corollary to the proper worship of God is that it will attract people to the faith. It's a side benefit, so to speak, not the direct purpose. And there's a reason that this is important, because I have found is that when people start to look at the Mass as a means of evangelization, a means of attracting people, they want to make it relevant. They want to make it attractive in the sense of being attractive to what people are used to in this world. So they want to make it like what you saw on MTV or on the internet or whatever. They want to make it something that's familiar to modern culture. But that really is not the right way to look at it. When we celebrate Mass looking at the people, figuratively and literally, looking at the people, what happens is we forget about the purpose of it, the vertical. When we think of the horizontal, we forget about the vertical. But conversely, when we think about the vertical and we're directed towards God, and that is why the priest is turned from us and towards God, leading us to God, when we do that, then the horizontal happens. Yeah. That's my strong belief that it happens. A great example of this is the famous story of the conversion of Russia. Vladimir was the head of Russia, and this was in the 900s, and he wanted to have a religion for the people. And so he sent people throughout Europe and Asia to say, okay, find the different religions and find a religion that we should embrace. And he went to the Muslims, and he was like, "No, there's nothing to this." They went to the Jews, nothing really here. They went, and I will say they went to Rome, and it was too simple for them. But then they went to Constantinople and they saw the beautiful liturgy that happened there in Constantinople. And they said, we knew not whether we were on earth or in heaven. We knew this was the true religion because of how they worship God. And so they ended up going back, and it converted Russia to Christianity. Because, of course, at the time, Christianity was completely together. It wasn't separate East and West like it is now. But the point being that those people who were worshiping in Constantinople, they weren't thinking, let's evangelize the Russians when they celebrated their liturgy. They were thinking, let's worship God properly. And so I really do think that if we worship God properly, that can be a great means of evangelization as a side benefit. And so what happens is when you go out and you talk about in evangelization, one of the things you're doing is you're trying to get people to understand God, who he is, because we have and who Jesus is. We have a very poor understanding in our culture of who Jesus is. The problem is everybody knows who Jesus is, but nobody actually knows who he is. So they all heard of Jesus, and they have this picture of him as this laid back kind of hippie dude saying, hey, tolerance and peace and be nice to each other. And if you read the Gospels, though, that's not Jesus. And so if our worship of Jesus in the Mass kind of has this laid back hippie feel, well, that's just going to foster that image of Jesus that frankly isn't very interesting to people. People don't want to follow that Jesus. They might think he's a good guy, but they're not going to give their lives to that Jesus. But the Jesus that you encounter at the traditional Latin Mass, this is the God of the universe, the creator of the universe, the one to whom we must bow and worship and give everything to. And yet we also have direct contact with in Holy Communion. So it's this almost like a tension, these two sides of it, that we have this God who's everything, and yet he comes down to us and we receive him. You get both aspects that I believe best at the traditional Latin Mass, because you see this great worship, but then you also receive him at the altar rail. Both of those things are occurring. And a story I like to remember from the Bible is in Revelation, chapter 1, I believe, when our Lord appears to John the Apostle on the island of Patmos, when he's going to give him the revelation of Revelation. What happens? Remember who John is. John was best friends with our Lord. He laid his head on his chest at the Last Supper. They were as intimate as two good friends could be. And yet, what does John do when he sees Jesus appear to him in all his glory? He falls down flat on his face to worship, because he recognizes this might have been my best friend and is my best friend, but he is also the Lord of the universe. And I feel like we get both of that in the traditional Latin Mass, and that's a great evangelization tool of showing who Jesus really is, and that we need to conform our lives to him, because unfortunately a lot of evangelization today ends up being, how can we conform the church to us, instead of how can we conform ourselves to the church and to our Lord. And so I think the traditional Latin Mass does a great job of showing that we need to change our lives and conform ourselves to God, not the other way around.
Yeah, and this is actually in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, quoting Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the document on sacred liturgy from Vatican II. It says exactly what you're saying. It says, the liturgy does not exhaust the entire activity of the church. It must be preceded by faith, evangelization, and conversion before it can produce effects in the life of the faithful.
And in fact, the evangelization, people would often ask me as director of evangelization, what do you point people to who want to learn more about the church? Like that, I always would say, you don't take them to Mass first. That's not the entry point for a potential convert to come back to come to the church, because it's not intended to be. You want to have more of a catechesis, maybe events at the parish, things like that. That's your direct. You lead them. It's just like how the early church, even the catechumens, were not even allowed to stay for the second half of the Mass, because they had not yet been baptized, and they weren't going to Mass until they were catechumens at all. So it's we might not have to go that extreme, but at the same time, I do think there should be more of that attitude of, okay, the Mass is something mysterious, in the most literal sense of that term. It's a mystery, and so therefore, when we're evangelizing people, that's not the first thing we do is bring them into Mass. That ends up being almost the last thing we do in a lot of cases.
So Monday through Saturday, let's use our creativity. Let's go evangelize. Let's try to be, all things to all men in a sense, like creatively bring people to the church. But Sunday is set apart. It's like our worship to God, and it should feel like we're doing something immensely important and cosmic, and like it's been around for 2,000 years.
Right, absolutely.
Net Ministries, St. Paul's Outreach, Focus, like let's do all these things, but not forget liturgy needs to remain liturgy.
Right, absolutely.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so I think we should jump right into those.
Awesome.
So this is from Everjohn. Oh, you already answered this. Maybe you could answer it in a different way. Is the traditional Latin Mass superior to the Novus Ordo?
I would say yes.
In what way?
Yes, it is. In that, as I was saying before, what it does, I believe it helps the human person to better worship God. The externals that are involved, both the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass, both involve obviously the consecration of the host and of the chalice and the transubstantiation, valid, all those things. But the externals help us to more deeply understand it in traditional Latin Mass, help us to be more open to the graces. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and when you say Novus Ordo, you can mean a lot of different things. Like you have Vatican II, which said one thing, then you have the implementation with the Concilium, which did another thing, and then you have people's experience of it, which usually doesn't line up with the rubrics. So then you have a third thing. So when you say the traditional Latin Mass is superior to the Novus Ordo, which of those are you talking about specifically?
I'm talking about because the Novus Ordo has been celebrated now for about 50 years, and there's a wide variation in how it's been celebrated in both time and place. Because I know people who go to in fact, my parish used to offer a Novus Ordo in Latin, and it had a lot of the things that you would normally associate with the traditional Latin Mass. So in my opinion, it was probably the best celebrated Novus Ordo on earth. And so that is obviously a lot closer to the traditional Latin Mass. But if you note, the reason is because it was a lot like the traditional Latin Mass. So even in that case, I would say the traditional Latin Mass was superior because of the prayers also. That's one thing I don't think people realize. And it might sound basic to a lot of people listening, but people might be surprised how many Catholics think the only difference between the traditional Latin Mass and Novus Ordo is the language. They think it's the exact same Mass, except for the fact that one's in Latin, one's not. That's not true. The prayers are very different between the two. And that was actually one of the first things that struck me. The first time I went to Latin Mass and I actually followed along in the Missal with the English translation, I was like, holy cow, these prayers are awesome. I can't believe how great these are. Why aren't we saying these all the time? And so you see that the prayers are frankly just superior. But then on the Novus Ordo also, you have a wide range of how to celebrate, and you get some places where it's really, really bad. I mean, there's which will not be named, but a chapel at a certain university not too far from here, where they don't always use even valid matter for the Mass. The bread isn't even always valid. And so obviously that's not even a Mass because it's invalid and things like that. But the point is you have this huge delineation between the different types. But I would say the more a Novus Ordo is said in a reverent fashion and including a lot of things that you would see in a Latin Mass, like incense and things like that, and prayer, and ad orientem, where the priest faces towards the altar, away from the people, towards God, having altar rails. All those things are good things, but they're all built into the traditional Latin Mass, along with the additional prayers and what I would say are more superior prayers. But again, I always get, whenever I say things like this, I get pushback that I'm denigrating the Novus Ordo. I'm not trying to. I'm simply comparing. I will denigrate when it's celebrated terribly. I mean, because that should never be done. But I'm simply comparing the two. And so, like I said, my parish used to offer what I would consider the best Novus Ordo Mass in the world. For years they did, and they actually switched it to the traditional Latin Mass. And I do say even that's superior. But again, it's not a matter of the people being better people or anything like that. It's more a matter, is the form objective when we look at the prayers being said, the rubrics, the externals, all those things. The traditional Mass has built into it things that are superior for us worshiping God.
This is from Solatium. As a father, are you more of a commentary during Mass or a catechesis at home guy in teaching your children about the Mass? Does that make sense?
Yes, what we do, always do it at home. At the Mass, we get them missals once they get to a certain age. One of my daughters just received her first communion this year, and so we got her a missal.
First communion, you think, is the right age for a missal?
Yeah, I mean, the little red missalettes we let her look at, but we got her own missal there because for a couple reasons. One is it just makes her feel like, okay, I'm part of what's going on here because I see dad using it. I see my older siblings using it. I see mom using it. And so I get to be part of that. I think there's a subconscious part of that. And also it helps them to start follow along. I am blanking on the name of this, of the missal I get them though. It's a children's missal. It's black. It's, it's got everything in there is in English basically, but it allows you to follow along what's going on with it. And so we do everything at home though. So for one thing we've always done, I learned this actually from Scott Hahn years ago, is the night before on Saturday night for our night when we pray before bed, we actually do the readings together. So we'll read the readings for the next day's Mass in English, and then I will go through them and explain them to the kids so that the next day they kind of have in their sense what the day is, especially when you're going through days of like Lent or Advent or Easter, something like that. They get a sense of what's going on, what we're celebrating at that Mass. So, and then I will talk to them as they prepare for First Communion is when I do catechesis of what's going on in the Mass. So there's the regular weekly talking about the readings. There's leading up to First Communion where that's when I actually explain what's going on in the Mass, not during Mass, but outside of Mass. And then after First Communion, give them a missal and help them along as needed.
Nice. The dad of Catholic Twitter has spoken. Is it the Latin Mass children's missal?
That sounds right.
Is it black with like gold embossing on it?
Yes, I think so, yeah. I wish I had it with me, but it's upstairs,
right.
I think.
Latin Mass children's missal, for everyone who's wondering. So here's another question from Clinton. Hi, Eric. How do we introduce the TLM to Novus Ordo Catholics who don't know of the existence of the TLM? Should this be done incrementally, given the baggage we bring from decades of formation in the new Mass? Do you want me to read it again? You good?
Yeah, no, I got it. I would definitely say incrementally is probably the way to go because as my own story shows, typically most people incrementally get there. I really think it's a mistake, in my opinion, to try to get people to drink from the fire hose because it really is the traditional Mass really is a fire hose and it takes time. I mean, it took me years and most people I know, and I know there are exceptions where people just change overnight. But I do think we have to be understanding that every Catholic we talk to just about has been formed in the Novus Ordo and usually with a lot of bad catechesis of even not that has nothing to do with the Novus Ordo, just bad catechesis of what it means to be Catholic. And so we have to gradually get them to understand more and more the more fullness of the faith. And I think with the traditional Latin Mass, one way is just the beauty of it can be, so we're talking here about somebody who's already practicing Catholic in this situation, but just the beauty if, for example, like for me, going to that solemn high Mass for the Feast of Presentation GC was huge for me. It just opened my eyes to a whole new reality. And so, for example, if you know there's going to be a solemn high Mass in your city or your area, that's a perfect thing, in my opinion, to invite them to. And make sure you emphasize ahead of time. Don't worry about following along. Just come and just experience it. And I think that can really be an eye opener for people who are already practicing Catholics. But they've just only gone to Novus Ordo, or they may even have bad impressions. And let's be honest, there are many bad impressions out there of traditional Catholics. And so and I think that'd be a way to say like, wow, this is pretty amazing. If you can do that, even a high Mass, a low Mass is fine too, but I really feel like you got to catechize the person for a low Mass because they need to understand the whole idea of the idea of a Mass where you don't hear almost anything the priest is saying is a real challenge that we have to overcome for people to overcome to really appreciate it. And I love going like daily mass. I love going to a low mass now, but I honestly, I didn't at first. When we first were going to Latin Mass Parish weekly, every Sunday, we'd always choose the high mass because we have a low mass at one time, high mass. We always go to the high mass. And now though, I don't have each one has its own beauties to me.
This is from, let's see, where are we at? This is from Rookie. What are your thoughts on lay ministers of Holy Communion at Mass?
Let's just not have them. I mean, really, I don't think, I really do think the way that the Mass was worshipped, was celebrated over the centuries, it catechizes us to certain things. For example, that there is a distinction between the priesthood and the laity. And that distinction is very clear. We see it's very clear in the traditional Latin Mass, because the laity, other than the servers, and really the servers originally were seminarians. We just don't have enough seminarians, so now we have young men there. But really, the laity just stays out of the sanctuary. They don't cross the altar rail, and I think it tells us that there is a definite difference between them. There's a distinction between them, and also it shows a great reverence for Holy Communion, that only the priest, only those who are ordained, only their hands can touch the sacred host. And I think that's a beautiful catechesis as well, because it makes it very clear this is special. I mean, especially as you grow up in it. I mean, an 8-year-old who receives their first communion and they've never seen anybody even touch the host other than the priest. Well, when they receive, and they're going to receive on the tongue because it's the only way you can receive in traditional Latin Mass, I really do think they realize this is a huge deal. This isn't like a piece of candy that's been handed out by everybody and their brother, but this is something only the priest has ever touched. Wow. And then it comes upon my lips. And so I think it gives that sense they wouldn't necessarily know the story of the angel and Isaiah and I have unclean lips and Nicole and everything, but it would give that experience to them of this is the Holy of Holies touching me, and that's a big deal. It's not a big deal if everybody and their brother's been touching it beforehand. So I would just say I don't think we should have Eucharistic extraordinary ministers, whatever we call them this week.
Even for faithful Catholics who attend Novus Ordo, actually in the rubrics, it's forbidden to use extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion in an ordinary fashion. So to always,
that's the name, extraordinary.
Yeah, it's actually forbidden in the rubrics to use them ordinarily every Sunday. You know, there might be some kind of, I mean, I agree with you, but I'm just imagining a situation where you have so many people at Mass that it would take, you know, an hour to distribute communion. But what I always say is that's when we should spend most of our time. There's no reason to rush, to be really efficient at the time when we're coming in contact with Almighty God.
And I remember Pope Benedict, he was criticizing the big papal masses, and he's obviously the Pope, and he's saying this. And one of the things he seemed to indicate he would have preferred if they just didn't distribute communion, which is fine. It's not like we're required to receive communion in order to celebrate Mass. And that's a big thing we have to realize too, is that people think it is right to communion when they go to Mass, but really that's not always the case. And so I would just say in those odd situations where you just have this huge number of people, that's probably going to be a rare situation. You don't have to distribute communion. And if it's a regular situation, well, then I think that's just something, like you said, it shows how important this is, that we're willing to spend time. I remember when I was Protestant, I remember going to a African-American Baptist church on a Sunday, and it was like 3 hours long. And nobody there cared. That's what they did every week. And nobody was thinking like, oh no, we have to get within an hour. I mean, that's a Catholic thing. I mean, I think mainline Protestants do this some too, that like there's this time bomb that's going to go off if we go over an hour. If we take an hour and a half, we take 2 hours, well, then that's the case. I mean, that's just what happens. And so I think this idea of thinking about efficiency is a mistake. And so I don't think there's ever a reason why we have to have lay people distributing communion.
Yeah, and that's coming from a dad with kids who's trying to keep them
Yeah.
still during
Oh
Mass.
yeah, they get antsy after a while. But I do think if it's regular, if Mass is always an hour and a half to 2 hours every week, your kid's going to get used to it, and they just know, okay. Just like if it normally was a half an hour and also it was an hour, they get squirrely. Well, if it's normally an hour and it goes half, I mean, it's just whatever it's the norm is what they get used to over time.
This is from Marvin, and this is our last question before we wrap up. What would you say to people who start going to the TLM but feel that the Gregorian chant sounds boring or doesn't engage them in the way they could sing English hymns in the Novus Ordo?
I would be surprised, to be honest, because the Gregorian chant has been developed over centuries, and it's something that really speaks to the depths of the soul. And if I was being completely honest, I would say that the person who says that probably has been malformed in their understanding of beautiful music, and that should change. And that's probably the biggest takeaway I would say, is that when you go to traditional Latin Mass regularly, you will be changed. And so that's why it won't be changed the first time, but you will be changed. And so part of that is the music. You will come to appreciate the beauty of this traditional music that's been sung like this for centuries. And you'll realize it's so much more than the crap you hear on the radio. But the truth is, if you've analogy, if you've always eaten McDonald's and that's all you've ever eaten, when you go to a 5-star restaurant, you probably aren't going to like it at first. And you might even for a while be like, this isn't what I'm used to. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't really like this. I'd rather have McDonald's. But objectively, the 5-star restaurant's serving superior food, but you have been conformed to the McDonald's. And so when you're conformed to this bad music outside of church, then it's hard at first to really realize that this music that you're hearing at the traditional Mass is a superior form of music objectively. And then but over time, I do believe you will start to realize that, and you'll start to be like, okay, this really is so much more. And so what will happen is you'll stop really liking the other. It's like I had to cut out sugar in my diet a couple years ago, and I ate a lot of sugar before that. And when I was eating sugar, I hated vegetables. I hated those things that are good for you. I thought they tasted awful. Well, once I cut out sugar after probably 6 months or so, now all of a sudden, broccoli tastes good to me. I like broccoli. Not only is it good for me, I actually like the taste of it now because my taste buds and everything had to be changed over time from practice. And I think the same thing happens going to traditional Latin Mass. It's good for you objectively, just like broccoli is. And over time, you actually come to appreciate it, and you realize this is actually, like we were talking about preferences, now you prefer it. But the preference came later, after the objective superiority of getting yourself trained to prefer it.
Yeah, even Vatican II says Gregorian chant has pride of place in the liturgy. Right. And if it's been around for 2,000 years and the church has embraced it for 2,000 years, we need to get on board with it.
Right,
it's like,
right.
It is healthy food. In that
it's not them, it's us.
Yeah, it will be around for another 2,000 years. That's Absolutely. The importance of it. So just a short plug for our documentary we're doing, Mass of the Ages, on Kickstarter. Thank you to our 222 backers. You believe in this project enough to actually support it financially. Thank you so much. We're at 26% funded with a couple weeks more to go. I looked at our Facebook numbers. We have about 1,800 followers. Here's the deal. If we got half of you who like what we're doing, who are following what we're doing, if we got just half of you to support us at the $25 level, we would reach our goal this next week, in the next couple of days, of 50%. Now, here's the thing about 50%. The stats say if you raise 50% of your funding, then you have a 96% chance of getting fully funded. So the people who already are interested in what we're doing, over the next couple of days, consider giving to this project, and you can ensure that we'll have a 96% certainty that we'll get fully funded. So that's where we're at. It's really exciting. Eric, how can people connect with you?
Oh, probably the easiest way is Twitter. I'm on Twitter, just Eric R. Sammons is my handle. That's where I'm most active. And I set up a Parlor account, which is a newer social media, and I might be on there some. But for right now, till they kick me off, I'm on Twitter. So that's the easiest way. And they may kick me off. You never know.
You never know. Thanks so much, Eric Sammons. We really appreciate you. Thanks for your joy and enthusiasm for the faith. We always love talking to you, and so excited to bring out more of your interview that we did. Spent 2 hours with Eric Sammons for the documentary, and he just said so many good things. So we're excited to release that. So have a good day.
Thank you very much. Support the Kickstarter.
Thank you. Peace.